Hi everybody, I'm Kanav and welcome back to my YouTube channel, or welcome to you if this is the first time you're visiting my YouTube channel. I make thoughtful videos about the Supreme Court of India and how Supreme Court of India's judgments intersect with queer rights. And today I'm going to talk about perhaps one of the most important, but also one of the most disappointing, perhaps one of the most disappointing judgments for India's queer community, and that is the Supreme Court of India's decision on marriage equality. So I'm going to start by first talking about the judgment, then giving my thoughts on the judgment, explaining what I think the Supreme Court did wrong and where I think it could have actually done better. So let's start by first breaking down what actually happened. So the case actually involved a batch of petitions by queer people, which included some queer couples, requiring or requesting the government to recognize same sex and queer marriages. And I should note that the petitioners came from a range of backgrounds. Some of them were in marital relationships, some of them were single people, but they all required, or rather, they all demanded that the government recognize their relationships at par with their heterosexual counterparts. Many petitions were filed initially before various high courts, and then they made their way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court did was it compiled all the petitions into one set, and that set was basically what became the Suprio versus Union of India batch of petitions, where Suprio was one of the Suprio Chakravarti, to be more precise, he was one of the petitioners in the case. What eventually happened was that on October 17th, 2023, so more than 2 years ago, the Supreme Court handed down its judgment. It was a five-judge constitution bench which comprised of the then Chief Justice of India, Dr. D.Y. Chandrachud, um, Justices S.K. Kaul, Justices S. Ravindra Bhatt, Justice Hema Kohli, and Justice P.S. Narasimha. So these were the five judges who were on the bench, and they delivered the verdict on the case. And it was a 3-2 verdict. What happened was, in the minority, you had Chief Justice Chandrachud and Justice Kohli, who were in favor of recognizing queer relationships only through civil unions. Whereas the other three justices, Justices Bhatt, Kohli, and Narasimha, which formed the majority, they ruled that there could be no legal recognition to any form of same sex relationships. So that was 3 2. I repeat, you had two justices who ruled in favor of civil unions, and you had three justices who ruled in favor of no recognition. What all five judges agreed on was that there was no fundamental right to marry, and that was important. All five judges held that there was no fundamental right to marry. However, all five judges also held that queer couples do have the right to form relationships and live with dignity. That's important. The idea of there being a right to a relationship was deemed to be a fundamental right, but not that you have the right to now ask the government to recognize your relationship. That's where the problem came in, because the queer petitioners were asking the Supreme Court to recognize the right to not just form a relationship, but to have that relationship have a legal basis. So the legal basis, which of a relationship, which leads to other issues and leads to other benefits, such as inheritance, adoption, pension, next of kin rights, all of that, the majority, the three judges in the majority said that's Parliament's job, not the court's job. Um, so it's very interesting because Chief Justice Chandrachud recognized civil unions but not marriages, and his argument was that the state cannot deny legal recognition to queer relationships, and if not marriage, why not unions? Justice Call agreed with him and even went a step further and said that the Special Marriage Act, which was one of the laws that was being challenged, Justice Call argued that that was discriminatory because it assumed marriage, because it could not be assumed that it only limits marriages between men and women. It had to expand to queer people as well. Um, but unfortunately, the majority did not agree. They believed that the Special Marriage Act was never meant to cover same sex couples, and that reading words into the Special Marriage Act would tantamount to judicial overreach. So ultimately, the culmination of everything was that there would be no marriage rights, no civil unions. You have to go to the parliament to enforce your rights. So that was like a very brief, very short overview of a very complicated judgment. Now let's talk. Let's now move on to the next part where I'm going to tell you what my take on it is. Was the Supreme Court right? In my opinion, it was not. So let me be very clear. The court found that queer couples face discrimination. It also acknowledged that stigma and inequality was an experience of queer people's everyday lives. And yet, oddly enough, the majority refused to rectify that wrong. And this is where I feel that the judgment failed, not just morally, but constitutionally also. Now, there are three provisions of the Constitution, Articles 32, 142, and 144, that gives the power that gives the Supreme Court both the power and the duty to enforce fundamental rights and ensure complete justice. And it has done this before. Just a quick recap for those of you who are not familiar with these provisions. Article 32 guarantees every citizen the right to directly approach the Supreme Court for the enforcement of fundamental rights, which the Supreme Court is empowered to do, that is, empowered to enforce those fundamental rights through various writs, directions, or orders as it deems relevant. Article 142 is also known as the provision of the law that gives the Supreme Court the plenary or the absolute power to pass any decree or order necessary for doing complete justice. Any form of uh, remedial measure that the court can take to ensure that if there is a denial of justice, the Supreme Court under Article 142 has the power to fix it. And finally, Article 144 mandates that all civil and judicial authorities throughout India must act in aid of the Supreme Court. This ensures that the Supreme Court's directions and judgments and directives are implemented by not just the lower courts but also the executive. So when you combine these three articles, 32, 142, and 144, you see that the Supreme Court has the power and the duty to enforce fundamental rights, and this could have applied to the queer community as well. And that's why it is surprising that it wasn't done here. I would also like to say that as a queer person, I view this judgment as a reflection of the judge's heterosexual privilege. Because you do have a set of people who very respectfully have lived in a very heteronormative framework. And to say that marriage is not a fundamental right may or may not be true, but to deny people the right to marry legally and to not do anything about it is a problem. And it is also a matter of heterosexual privilege because only heterosexual people have not had to fight for their right to, number one, have their sexual orientation decriminalized, and then number two, to have their marriages recognized. Of course, there are a few exceptions. Intercaste couples, inter-religious couples have had to fight for their marriages to be recognized. But it's very, but the struggles of queer people has been one step further, where their very identity, their very ability to live and exist has been up for debate. So, marriage, in my opinion, isn't just a personal choice, it is a gateway towards legal protection, social legitimacy, and economic security. And hence, by denying it to queer people, what it seems to me is that the court effectively told queer people, including people like myself, was that this message: your love is valid, but your rights are optional. We may or may not grant it to you at a later date, and so that is really unfortunate. And I will also say that this could have been a historic opportunity to build on the court's own previous progressive jurisprudence um, on queer rights, but instead it just stopped short, and I think it has slowed the momentum for LGBTQ rights. So, to kind of close, all I will say is that while I respect the authority of the Supreme Court, as all of us should, we should be clear that respect doesn't just mean silence, and that we should, can, and must critique judgments that deny equality, because that's how constitutional progress happens. So I'll end with this. Was the Supreme Court right? No. In my opinion, it was not. But I also think that it's up to us as citizens, as activists, and as community members to keep pushing until equality isn't just something that we ask for, it is something that we obtain and that is a facet and part of our everyday life. So let me know what you think. Do you agree with the Supreme Court's reasoning? Do you think it missed the mark? Or do you disagree completely with it? Feel free to let me know, and also let me know what topic you'd like me to talk about next. So feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. I hope you enjoyed this video.